Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you for joining us in today's event, Beat the Heat, taking on the cooling challenge in cities through innovation. I am your moderator today. My name is Lily Riahi, and I am the coordinator of the Cool Coalition, and I'll be with you for the next 90 minutes to take you through a very exciting discussion on how cities are tackling extreme heat, promoting resilience, and tackling growing cooling demand through innovation. So this event is actually hosted together with UNEP and the Cool Coalition, the Global Covenant of Mayors, the Rocky Mountain Institute, Clean Cooling Collaborative, and Mission Innovation. So we will start with some opening remarks, followed by a deep dive presentation from where we're going to launch a brand new urban cooling guide, followed by a panel with cities, national government representatives, industry, and then we will follow by an interactive session where you can actually pose some questions from the audience, putting your questions in the chat box, followed by a closing and call to action. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Dan Hamza, advisor to the COP unit and the Energy Transition Council, and the cooling lead for the UN High-Level Champions team for COP26. Dan Hamza, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lily, and hello to everybody wherever you are around the world. It's great to get the chance to connect. Firstly, and obviously, thank you to the Cool Coalition and various partners as just listed for the invitation and for hosting the webinar. I've just got 3 comments to help set the scene for the discussion today. The first is about science, the second is about solutions, and the third, not surprisingly, is about the COP. So on the science, I mean, I'll take a wild guess that most of you on this call care quite deeply about climate change and may or may not be kept awake at night time by some of the numbers. I try not to be, but I have to say the numbers that really are sort of stirring in my head are this need for a 50% reduction by 2030, and yet when we total up what's about to happen, we're looking at about a 16% increase. It's stretching my brain. This is the size of our task, and we're already at 1.1 degrees, and we're already, in particular this year, seeing some quite extreme weather events that we wouldn't expect to happen as frequently or as intensely or for such long durations, whether that's fires or floods or heat waves in the Arctic. So, you know, I really do think if planetary health. If this planetary health report was a personal health report from your doctor, you know, we would be doing so many different things. The science also tells us that cities are getting hotter at twice the rate of most other parts of the world. And of course, all of you know that cities account for a significant amount of carbon emissions. Some estimates suggest that could be 70%. So to keep 1.5 alive, to use the sort of COP catchphrase, we absolutely need action from cities, which is why we're on this call, right? Which is why we're doing this work, which is why we're dedicating our careers to this important topic. Secondly, in terms of the solutions, frankly, there's enough to keep us going until in cities. Requires significant action on cooling. The two things go together. We know enough about that, and you'll hear today from a variety of folks who are really at the cutting edge of taking forward what needs to happen in cities in relation to sustainable cooling, and that's in the realms of planning, that's in the realms of innovation and technology. That's about financing, that's about business models, it's about policy. Like, we've got a lot of tools in our toolbox now. We very much know everything we need to do, at least by 2030. You know, further out, we kind of know what we need to do. We just need a bit more time to make those solutions a bit more commercially viable. So well done team, well done RMI in particular, I know, and various others for pulling together the guide that will be launched at the COP. That's really a great way of summarizing the solutions and just, you know, allowing us to crack on at the speed that's needed to get work done by 2030. The final comment about COP is, well, it's finally going to happen. I think that's the most important thing after this incredibly long wait I hope as many representatives from around the world can get there as possible. These are challenging times, and efforts are being made to make it as inclusive as possible, but we have to be realistic about the situation we're in. So it's not like normal COPs, but we're all doing our best to make it as inclusive as possible. It's going to happen. A few heads up of things to look out for in the near negotiation space, which is really the area that I work in. So these comments aren't necessarily about the negotiation space, but look out for governments and non-state actors making breakthrough commitments, identify tipping points and move the ball. Look out for commitments from governments in particular on product efficiency, and in particular in relation to cooling. That's the work that's been going on with the call to action and the SEED initiative. Look out for the companies. Congratulations to the 11, maybe 12 of you in the cooling sector that have joined the race to zero. Look out for cooling featuring in NDCs. I lost count. We did a paper on it a while ago, but anyway, it was a really good number. It was triple the number it was in the first round. So congratulations to all the countries. I think some of those on the call today actually that have included cooling in their NDCs. And then just a plea really to take advantage of these moments. They're moments where collective attention of the world is on climate change. There's a collective expectation as well that exists out there, and just think about how you can use that attention and use those expectations in any way that you can in the work that you do on cooling and beyond, to try and extract maximum ambition from this moment so that we can close the gap and keep 1.5 alive. So thank you all for the invitation. Well done again for the forthcoming report. We look forward to profiling that at the COP at a launch event, and hopefully I'll get to see some of you there, and if not in person, then certainly virtually. Lily, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for setting the scene and reminding us about the fact that with all of the extreme weather events, and well, it reminds you of the latest IPCC report, as you mentioned, that's confirming that we're pretty much going through increasing warming world, and we may not make it to the 1.5 or 2 degrees, and therefore see these extreme weather events. And that cities are really where the heat is being felt. And so I think that call to action to make commitments and raise ambition towards the COP is pivotal for us to make this shift towards trying to get on the 1.5 or 2 degree path, and cities will be key in that. So I think it's very well placed to now hand over to Ian Campbell, Senior Fellow from the Rocky Mountain Institute, to give a presentation not only on the Urban Cooling Handbook, but also the actions within that handbook that cities can take to raise ambition and help us get on the 1.5 degree pathway. Ian, over to you.
Okay, that's terrific. Thank you, Lily. And let me just pull up the presentation. Short presentation that take you through here, and the presentation, Cooling Cities with Innovative and Comprehensive Strategies, and it's really built on some of the learnings and insights that we've gained over the last, really, I think, close to a year and a half in relation to the development of sustainable urban cooling handbook. As Dan kind of mentioned in his introduction, kind of referenced the latest IPCC report alerting of a faster warming trend. And unless we make immediate, rapid and large scale reductions in emissions, limiting warming to close to the 1.5 to 2 degree threshold could be beyond reach. And the impact in cities is double that. Our cities are heating up at twice the rate as the average global effect. And one of the dynamics that we see within urban island heat in city environments is it's not uniform. It's typically going to be worse in poor neighborhoods and communities. And I think we've seen a lot of heat maps that show that in cities around the world. The one that's the image here is actually of the city of Madrid. And typically in poor communities within city environments, there's less access to green spaces, less access to blue spaces, typically greater density, but also industrial operations are often taking place and emitting waste heat. So we see that it's not uniform. And when you look at what can cities do, we know that national and state authorities have preemption in certain areas, but that doesn't mean that doing nothing delivers an answer, because what happens is that doing nothing means that for those who can afford it, there's air conditioning, and not only just the incremental air conditioning, but also greater usage. And that just adds further to the urban heat island effect because of the rejected heat coming from distributed air conditioning systems. So that business as usual pathway is not a pathway that really can be our future. It adds to emissions and obviously consequent climate impact of cooling. Urban heat due to the heat rejection of the systems, but it also further increases the equity divide in cities between those that have access to cooling and those that don't and are in a part of the city where heat is just continuing to build. So in addressing this and kind of taking out of that pathway of those that can afford it, secure air conditioning for comfort within the city environment, you have to start at the urban scale. And to reduce heat at the urban scale means integration into planning and design. So it's urban form and design. It's looking at sources of waste heat within a city and addressing those. It's nature-based solutions and incorporating those into the urban form. And also cool and reflective surfaces that can be applied to urban infrastructure. What that does is obviously when you reduce the heat in the urban environment, that reduces the cooling load that buildings will experience. You can further reduce the cooling load on buildings by having thermally efficient buildings. And, typically that's driven by standards, codes, bylaws. But there's also opportunity for city governments to address the thermal efficiency of their own buildings. And a city government will typically own and operate many buildings within the city environment. And so reducing cooling loads at the urban level, then reducing cooling loads at the building level, and then looking at low, efficient and best fit cooling technologies to serve the residual loads within the buildings and within the environment, the urban environment, but also reducing the opportunity to reduce the impact of anthropogenic heat coming from rejected heat of distributed air-cooled air conditioning systems. So that sequence of framing for starting at urban scale, then to buildings, then to serving loads efficiently within the buildings is a rubric that will flow through the handbook that's been developed here. And building on that a little further, you can see the same rubric there: reduce heat at the urban scale, reduce cooling needs in buildings, serve cooling loads in buildings efficiently. And then down the side axis, what is it that a city government can directly control? What are the things that a city government can help facilitate? And then what are the combination measures, which is a combination, obviously, between the two. And you can see right at the top there, urban form and planning. So again, that's urban planning, density of development, the level of corridors, level of shading, airflow within the urban environment, integration of nature-based solutions. So as you say, green spaces and blue spaces and tree cover within the urban environment, and then cool surfaces for reflecting heat. From a combination perspective, looking at, okay, how do not only reduced heat with the active provision of cooling, but also do so in using most efficient, best available technology. And that will tend to drive you towards a servitization model. And the ultimate servitization model is district cooling, which is built on the lowest life cycle cost concept. With district cooling, you have the opportunity of using heat sinks and heat sources and shifting loads with things like thermal storage to actually ensure that the load profile of the provision of cooling isn't detrimental to the operation of the grid. One of the important things with district cooling is it's not only significantly more efficient because of being able to use best available technology and heat sinks, it actually reduces the impact of anthropogenic heat coming from the provision of active cooling. But district cooling doesn't happen without a city government's involvement. It's not something that the private sector can just step into. The environment has to be in place for district cooling to be able to scale as a solution. You then move down to energy efficient, thermally efficient buildings. The opportunity for cities to lead by example, not only with their own buildings, but also with their own transportation, municipal transportation fleets, and the opportunity to, again, move away from technologies that add to the waste heat within the urban environment. Community-centric initiatives, especially focused on advancing heat equity and access to cooling, often focused on poorer, more vulnerable communities within a city. And then the last two being facilitative measures, building awareness, building importance of building public support, and building capacity on the supply side, and then the funding and financing solutions, although key being the funding, because even if you're financing, there ultimately needs to be a funding source to enable that financing to be serviced. And we're just seeing some pretty amazing innovation in funding solutions from around the world that can actually generate revenues and put that into more, helping make our cities cooler. The steps of how to get started, it's not enough to just say, well, this is what you can do. It's also how and when. And like most things, it starts with leadership. It starts with a champion, and kind of understanding where you are. A citywide baseline assessment is foundational, really, to getting started. And then within each of those strategies, from the prior slide, there's a range of no regrets. And what I call no regrets is low cost, no cost, and low risk of unintended consequences associated with actions that can be taken. So these are places to get started and start building support. The other area for getting started is trigger points. And, within each of these strategies, there's measures that can be taken that are preparatory measures to ensure that when a trigger point occurs, that would provide a low cost opportunity for integrating a more sustainable cooling approach, that those aren't missed, because they don't come by so often. And so making sure those preparatory steps are in place is key, and identifying where those trigger points are is an important part, again, of getting started. So what those do is provide the opportunity for early action, which can enable support to be garnered to take the first steps towards a sustainable urban cooling future. And then that in turn gets integrated into a sustainable urban cooling master plan once developed. But that's one of the key learnings that we had, is that there's a lot of things that can be done before that big sustainable urban cooling master plan is developed, that actually build on each other and can really help gain support. So we'll be launching the handbook November 3rd at the Nordic Pavilion, COP26. The handbook itself, it details out the intervention strategies in considerable depth. We have over 80 supporting examples and case studies as to where these strategies have been implemented and how the city government went about doing so. And obviously, the goal is that this handbook is one that's action-orientated and is able to be utilized in a way that aligns with the unique context of individual cities and their environment. So, and thank you to the people that supported this within the Cool Coalition. Many people provided input and contributions, but especially to those behind the work, which was UNEP, Global Covenant of Mayors, Mission Innovation, Clean Cooling Collaborative, and RMI. So thank you very much. And I think at this point, I hand over back to Lily. So thank you, Lily.
Thank you very much, Jan, for that very good teaser. I think the no-cost and low-cost actions that can be taken is something that we should be all looking to identify in our work with cities. So that was it's great that that's in the handbook, and I think we all look forward to teasing out those actions with the cities that we work with in piloting this handbook. So now I think we can switch over to the panel discussion. We have with us today a very diverse panel, and I'll just give an overview of who is in the panel with us first before starting the panel. So we have Yves-Laurent Sapoval, who's Senior Advisor, Directorate for Housing, Urban Development and Landscapes from France. We have with us Sudhir Perla, who's a Country Manager for the work in India of Tabreed. Winston Chow, Associate Professor of Science, Technology and Society from Singapore's Management University. We have Ms. Cook Nguyen, National Ozone Coordinator for Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment in Vietnam. And we have with us Graham Maidman, co-lead of Mission Innovation's Innovation Community on Affordable Heating and Cooling of Buildings, representative from the UK government and professor of London South Bank University. So to get us started, I'd like to ask all of the panelists about the impact of extreme heat and rising temperature in the city or countries that you're working with, and some of the key actions that the cities you're working with are taking to tackle both extreme heat and also growing cooling demand. So to start, I turn to you, Yves-Laurent, if I may. You're an expert on sustainable urbanization and architecture. Can you tell us about the impact of extreme heat in France? We've certainly seen a lot of these extreme weather events in France over the last few years. And what are the key effects that are, key efforts that are underway to counter the risk of extreme heat to citizens?
Hello, thank you, Lily, for inviting me. And I would say it's not that extreme. It's very sudden for us because it's not something we've been used to before. Mm-hmm. So we had, the first shock we had was in 2003 when we had a terrible heat wave and nearly 20,000 deaths. The cost estimated of that heat wave was up to 3 billion euros for the French economy. We had tension on energy production, and we still experience this kind of events. We have air pollution because of that induced mobility restrictions. We have, for example, constructions suffering damages due to extension and retraction of soils. This is not very usual, but we have soils rich in clay, and when it's very, very hot, it's very dry too, and so the soil retracts and the construction suffer. We anticipate more, and we anticipate more forest fires, water scarcity, and more structurally, probably population movements from one city to another, affecting also infrastructure and housing at the large scale. So what are the efforts we are undertaking? This is, you know that France is a decentralized country. So actions are taken both at national level and in terms of general policies and regulation, and at local level. In terms of national level, we have a national plan for adaptation to climate change, including recommendations and measures on governance, knowledge, data, informations, resilience, adaptation in natural environments. And at the local level, every city of more than 20,000 inhabitants must have what we call an air, climate, and energy plan, including mitigation and adaptation measures. That includes also diagnostic, territorial strategy, and an action plan. This plan takes into account urban planification, mobilities, soil consumption, I'll get back to that, and the local urban documents take already take already in account the design to avoid certain consequences of climate change, such as forbidding urban development in dangerous areas. This is, of course, important due to flooding and things like that. So the air, climate, energy plans are very different from one city to another. It is impossible to describe as a whole, but it can include very precise measures such as characterizing fresh urban spaces and urban heat islands, using high albedo materials in order to reflect the daylight, integrate nature and water in cities, adapting urban design, mobility practices. In terms of solutions, we can quote, for example, schools using Canadian well implanted under the playground to refresh the inside air. It's a very simple process of tubes circulating and distributing it into the classrooms. We have also solutions in terms of cinema theaters with geothermic cooling system using natural, 15 degrees water at 70 meters underground, or even more, bioclimatic buildings using natural ventilations instead of cooling. And this occurs, that we have islands in France. It doesn't, some people forget this, but we have Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Réunion Island. And the Réunion Island specifically develop a very high level of technicity regarding this bioclimatic architecture in buildings. Because more important, and I will get back to it, at a moment then when we're expected to double the built area by 2050, we think that buildings is one of the most important things, and the envelope of buildings is very important. A lot can be done. Well, that's about all in the timing.
Well, thank you so much. For sharing the various activities that are being done nationally and locally, which is great to see the synergy between the national and the local level. I think most marked is this air, climate, energy plans. First of all, it's integrated to begin with, air, climate, and energy. That's great. And also for places that are beyond 20,000 inhabitants, that means practically everywhere has one of these plans. So yeah. That's super. It's no wonder that you're coming up with so many innovative solutions to tackle this problem. And the other thing I was interesting to hear was that, 3 billion euros for the French economy. I think people forget when we talk about this, this is also very much an economic issue. It is not only, it is about health and well-being, but health and well-being also has a cost on the economy in terms of jobs, for example, and not being able to work effectively when you have such stress.
Mobility restrictions, jobs, yeah.
Yeah, and I think actually there was a recent study with the ILO that showed that, basically if we continue with the 1.5 degree by 2030, around 80 million full-time jobs would be lost due to heat stress. 80 million.
And that's a global,
that's it.
Public works, building, lots of outdoors activities. Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's, they said here, cost global economic loss of 2.3 trillion. So yeah, it's very real, the impact of this challenge on our health, well-being, but also jobs and economy. With that, maybe I can turn actually to you, Winston, because I know that in Singapore, you've already increased you know, I mean, Yves Laurent said it was more sudden, right? So it's nice to see that France is also, I mean, it's not nice to see, but it's clear that it's even countries that are not experiencing extreme heat all the time have these impacts. But Singapore has already increased in temperature from 26.9 to 28 degrees as an average in the last 40 years. That's pretty significant. So, and we understand it can increase further by 4.6 degrees by the end of the century. I mean, I don't even know what that would be like. I can't even imagine. So what are the current and projected impacts of this in Singapore's urban areas? And more importantly, how are you trying to mitigate this, I think?
Okay. Thanks, Lily. Yes, it's a very warm future that we're going to be facing, a hot future, so to speak. In fact, the present is rather hot as well. Right now, it's just past 8 p.m. in Singapore, and it's about 30 degrees Celsius right now, barely an hour after sunset. So it's unpleasant. I wouldn't say it's a sharp shock in terms of extreme temperatures, but it's just background wise, it's rather uncomfortable with the heat that we're facing. Obviously, compared to the past, as you pointed out, we've warmed quite a fair bit. Actually, if you look beyond 40 years, if you look at the temperature data from 1950 until last year, we've warmed by about 1.8 degrees Celsius compared to the historic past. So the reasons behind this warmth, it's not just the global climate change that we're considering about, but it's a direct consequence of the urban heat island, which has arisen from the very rapid development that has taken place in Singapore since the 1970s. A little primer, we are a city-state. We are 100% urbanized with a current population of 5.5 million people. And housing this 5.5 million people so that they can live, work, and play in this country will have inadvertent consequences to our urban climate. Previous measurements of temperature undertaken in the past, when you compare temperatures taken downtown in the heart of the city with our forested interior, can be up to 7 degrees Celsius at 10 p.m. at night. So it could be 30 degrees Celsius in the commercial core of Singapore, but 23 degrees Celsius in the forested areas surrounding the city. On average, it's about 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. So it is considerable, this local warming. And previous research has indicated the two primary causes of this is that replacement of forested areas with urban material, your concrete and your asphalt and your glass, it stores more heat during the day, and it then releases it steadily over the night that causes this heat island. Together with the sort of waste heat that Ian was talking about earlier, primarily generated from the immense amount of traffic activities in Singapore, and especially that of air conditioning. Now, Lily, you asked me about the impacts. Presently, the impacts can be quickly summarized as more heat stress, more heat stroke, and more heat-related injuries, particularly for those that are biologically predisposed to these sort of heat injuries, the very old or the very young. But there's also distinctions in terms of vulnerability that was mentioned. If you are spending a lot of time outdoors in this hot environment, if you are working in the building and construction sector, if you're working in the military, for instance, you will be exposed to this heat at a higher degree more than people who work indoors in this environment. But it's not just the heat stress, which admittedly it can be fatal, but also generally everybody will face an increase in thermal discomfort. So when you walk outdoors, you will feel that heat immediately upon leaving your shaded or air-conditioned environment. However, there is that worrying trend, though, that goes beyond just the impacts to the person or the individual. I mentioned the ubiquitous use of air conditioning in Singapore. And air conditioning has that potential vicious cycle in terms of contributing to more greenhouse gas emissions, primarily since in Singapore, we get our power mainly from natural gas, a fossil fuel. So increased use of air conditioning to adapt to the heat island will unfortunately increase Singapore's greenhouse gas emission contributions. So in the future, we expect more of the same in terms of these heat stress and heat stroke issues for individuals. The local heat island will definitely combine with climate change. We could, depending on the emission scenarios, see that 3 or 4 degrees plus warming outcome, which nobody wants to face at the end of this century. But we have to consider these things that can happen. Locally, as I mentioned, the heat island is driven by development. Like most other cities in Asia, Singapore will have more urban development in the pipeline, both in terms of greenfield and brownfield developments for residential and commercial areas. These will be in the works over the next 10 years, and they will result in more local urban warming. So it's baked in that we'll be facing the consequences of this. However, whether or not this is exacerbated by global warming, by climate change, is really dependent on what other countries are committed to when they made their initial Paris Agreement commitments in 2015. So we have to pay a lot of attention to what happens next month in Glasgow to see if that 3 or 4 degrees C warming is something that we'll face in Singapore.
Thank you for that. I mean, yeah, I remember, I think it was from Rocky Mountain Institute who mentioned that cities could warm as much as 4.4 degrees on average because of the urban heat island effect. So it's very real. And as you said, there's a vicious cycle there with the power sector consumption due to air conditioning. So it's felt at multiple levels in society, let's say. And as you ask the question of what it is that we should be doing, globally, let's say, and to look at the COP, maybe I can, with that, translate over to Graham and see, because Graham, you from Mission Innovation are working with many different cities and countries on tackling urban cooling issues. What do you think are some key enabling actions for cities and countries to start developing cooling strategies to tackle this issue at the urban level?
Yeah, thanks very much, Lily, and brilliant. Well done to you and to Ian from RMI for this document. It's a fantastic contribution, and for me, it sort of starts us on this sort of focused journey. It gives us visibility, and I think in the past, perhaps on an international level, we didn't have visibility of the challenge. But also the opportunity associated with cooling in cities. And, it's different depending on where you are in the world. So in the UK, for instance, cooling is not very obvious for our temperate climate. However, overnight, in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen a tremendous global warming and a tremendous impact on our buildings overheating. And to give you a stat, compared to 20 years ago, effectively every year our UK cities have moved about geographically about 40 kilometers south every year for the last 5 years. And if you were to sort of extrapolate that for the next 20 years, the climate in the UK is effectively that of Barcelona, which is lovely, fantastically lovely, but our buildings have not been designed for that climate, and it's how we move forward starting today is really important, and this guide gives us visibility of this, okay, and it makes it straight for cities and the officials, makes it really important for them to consider. I think Winston made a really good point about those that actually need cooling need to not just use more room air conditioners. They need to do it in a more sustainable way. So perhaps for those that actually have got cooling, it's a slightly different argument, but this guide really puts it front and center for cities to get going. And I think for me, that's the biggest challenge. We need to it gives us visibility. We need to get started. And then Ian sort of raised some really good points about how we get started. The steps within the guide show, what sort of path we need to use. So what we need to do, how we need to do it, when, etc. making sure that we use a mix of mitigation and adaptation. We pick up on trigger points, etc. And the big issue is how we fund. Okay, and perhaps even the bigger issue is making sure we've got fairness and access for all. So I think this is a really good start, and yeah, we need to keep some momentum moving forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the equity issue you mentioned is it also came up in what Winston was mentioning, where he spoke about, you know, heat stress having a different impact on depending on where you're working, you know, if you're outdoors or not. I mean, that already is telling you that the impact will raise equity issues in terms of who has to deal with the consequences, immediate consequences. I wanted to now actually ask Cook. I don't know, Cook, if you can unmute. I know you were having some troubles. If not, if one of our wonderful IT colleagues could unmute Cook from who's muted. I think, Cook, you can unmute yourself, if I'm not mistaken, but if not, then maybe somebody from the session can unmute her. I mean, Vietnam is definitely very much also seeing the impacts of extreme heat, I know, in terms of both health and productivity. And actually, Vietnam is one of the countries that Dan was referring to who has included cooling in their NDC. So I know that this is a very important issue. Apparently, Cook is unable to unmute. So if colleagues on this call could unmute her, that would be really great. In the meantime, I will turn to Sudhir. But I will hope that our colleagues from tech could help Cook to unmute herself. Sudhir, I think, you know, we've heard a lot about enabling conditions and impacts and some different solutions we've been hearing. You know, from an industry perspective, can you tell us a little bit about your work at Tabreed in terms of implementing innovative solutions to tackle extreme heat and growing power demand in cities?
Sure. Thanks, Lily. And I think it's been a great introduction so far in terms of what each one has mentioned on what could be done and what needs to be done, essentially on the cooling side. And building on what Ian said from his teaser, like you said, of the handbook, right? I mean, and just talking specifically of district cooling and maybe getting a little bit more, I mean, in terms of, I mean, how it actually can translate into achieving some of the benefits that we've been talking about of what needs to be done. I mean, essentially what district cooling does is it's all about, we know that there is growing cooling demand, especially in the Southeast Asian countries and so on and so forth, right? And it's all about aggregating cooling demand rather than the current conventional model where each building meets a cooling demand individually using a variety of technologies and a variety of models. Whilst at the urban scale, you could have the standards, codes and bylaws, and probably some of the more progressive developers could also adopt better thermal design for the buildings. What district cooling does is it takes that one level further by just ensuring that by aggregating demand and it can be as big or as small as, I mean, as practical as it is, right? It can just be a set of 5-6 buildings or even much more than that, where you just strip out the big part of the demand, energy demand for a building, which is cooling, into one central location, essentially. Once you remove the cooling demand out from the buildings, what is left residually could be, of course, then met even through rooftop solar and so on, essentially making the buildings move towards net zero buildings much sooner. And then that demand that you pull out of energy at a building level into a central system could then be, through more sophisticated district cooling players, be done in, of course, you deploying much better technology, much better design, much more energy efficient systems, and some of the concepts that the guide, I'm sure, refers to and what Ian mentioned on enabling better use of heat sinks or having thermal storage and just reducing the anthropogenic heat, I mean, within the buildings itself. All kind of naturally can be achieved through an aggregated central cooling system for a set of buildings at a much cheaper cost, right? And what we've been doing essentially in India as a private player is basically, I mean, pending the overall regulatory market environment falling in place and the whole connect between national, state, and the city level things coming together, since of course we can't wait for that to happen. As a private player, what we're essentially doing is trying to take this dialogue further to the market and at whatever size makes sense, essentially we're trying to implement more on a B2B basis district cooling systems by designing, building, owning, and operating central cooling plants, essentially, to ensure that from the conventional model of someone buying and having their own systems, you have a more central system that can achieve these sustainable benefits, plus also make it more cost effective, right? And that's what we've been doing. So we bring in, as a private player, the experience and the execution capabilities, of course, an understanding of what kind of business model innovation is required to make it work, and bring in the capital as well as private capital. I mean, of course, and that will only flow in areas where you know it's economically viable, and there is some level of market conditioning required to be done for it to work at a broader, more rapid scale. But where it does work, I think we bring in the capital, we bring in the expertise, we bring in the know-how, and essentially make sure that a more sustainable offering can be provided on a long-term basis, right? So it's like, it's kind of taking all that's out there and what we're talking about practically into the market and at a fairly large scale, depending upon on the practicalities and economics of each individual district cooling plant that is being planned. And of course, I think, for this to scale up much faster, you need a much more of an enabling environment, but still, nevertheless, it shouldn't wait till then. And the work's been going on. So yeah, I can talk more later, but so that's broadly, I think how district cooling can help.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, I definitely, Jan had shown district cooling as one of the solutions in tackling urban cooling. When it's a dense enough area, then it makes a lot of sense to do that as an efficient solution. And also the servitization model that he mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. So that's great to hear about the work that you're doing in India. And I know I can see Winston also nodding. So I guess I know you guys also have a very cool district cooling system. So I know that's probably why you're nodding. So I think, going back to you, Laurent, I think, we've heard a little bit about the impacts and some about solutions. In Paris, where you are, of course, I know they plan to become the greenest city by 2030 and to achieve 50% of the city covered by planted areas by 2030. I think this might be one of the low-cost, no-cost solutions that Ian was referring to that can really help mitigate, urban heat island effect and contribute to a healthy, livable city. What, in your opinion, has driven Paris to take action on this and set such an ambitious strategy? And how will the city actually achieve this goal in terms of being the greenest city and having this 50% green infrastructure?
Yeah. Well, there's a few things I want to say about that. Paris is a city. I'm not from the city of Paris, so I'm not the best person probably to answer this question, but I can give you some information. Paris is a very dense city. Paris, and as you know, the city of Paris is only the center of the Paris region. So if you calculate, for example, there's about 11 million inhabitants in the Paris region, and the agglomerated Paris region, and Paris is only 2 million inhabitants. So when you talk about Paris, you talk about the very center and most urbanized place of the Paris region. It would be the hyper center of London, for example. So it's a very dense and very built city with not a very high rate of green space per inhabitant compared to other cities. And but it's not easy to compare as if you want to compare to London, you might have to compare to the old Paris region. That would be different. Anyway. Anne Hidalgo and the mayor of Paris have been setting up some very ambitious goal at this regard. And it is true that, as I said, it is very needed because the center of Paris, if you look at the curves of temperature, the center of Paris is one of the highest temperature in all the Paris region because it's less, notably because it's less green. So to do this, as you said, it will take time, and it will take considerable measures. And those measures are probably inevitably going to be using lots greening, planting trees on lots of public spaces. I think you have seen some very ambitious projects on the Place de la Concorde, Place de l'Hôtel de Ville, and very other iconic places. But those iconic places will not be sufficient to the whole coverage that the mayor is going to is willing to put in place. This means that there will be, and it will be my second point, there will be a need for using infrastructures that are currently used for a car circulation in Paris. There will be a need for planting trees in streets and boulevards more than it is now. So this will not take place without a complete reflection on mobilities and change of mobilities. So it will be important to have a reflection on mobilities to deliver against this engagement, not only at the Paris level but also at the regional level. As you see, I mean, maybe you know that there has been lots of transformations into cycles places in Paris, so it's already a problem. So I think it will need a regional reflection on mobilities. So this is to say that first for Paris, but for every city, the reflection has to be integrated between mobilities, between habitat, and even integrated with the land around, because lots of the questions that are related to heat are related to the land around. For example, when there was a heat wave in Paris, the price of fresh vegetables raised more than 20%. So, and water scarcity is not a question of city only, it's a question also of agriculture around the cities to be able to feed the city. So anyway, as we are talking about nature in cities, I just want us also to point out that more generally in France, we have a general plan for nature in cities, and nearly every city in France has a plan for nature in cities integrated with the PCET I was talking about before, and different urban development things. Also, we have a very strong now a new Climate and Resilience Act that paves the way to net zero artificialization. This means that we are restricting drastically new urbanization in natural urban areas, and this is not easy to implement. We're at the beginning of implementing that, but this is a very strong orientation of the government generally. We have this nature in cities plan that has been taking importance also because of the COVID crisis. People have been lacking a lot nature in cities. So this is, well, at something, we have an expression in French that is in some way, à quelque chose malheur est bon. Well, unhappiness is good for something anyway. So the COVID crisis led us to real transformations of cities. And we also have a green and blue network regulation that imposes in all cities to take green and blue infrastructure in account for all urban documents. So that's mainly all I wanted to say. Just want to add maybe that, because there won't be space to talk about knowledge otherwise, developing the national and local expertise is highly necessary. And I can quote some urban agencies in France like the Paris Region Institute, or French agencies like Météo France or ADEME, who have both strong international cooperation policies, and we also develop platforms like Adaptaville that give local authorities, companies, and developers many informations on improved techniques and solutions selected by experts. And I think it is very important. I strongly recommend you to have a look at it, because the development of this expertise and knowledge is very, very important at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting intervention. I think what was really coming out from what you said was this idea that everybody speaks about integration a lot, but sometimes, I mean, this was a very concrete example of why you really need to take an integrated approach to planning, to transport and buildings and energy, for example, also in green and blue, and the trade-offs that you might see in doing such integrated planning that's important for the long-term vision. So I think that point about the mobility and buildings versus, and the nature, like the green infrastructure that will be planted, is a very important point that came out of what you said. I think, of course, the important of developing the necessary knowledge in this area of urban cooling. We hope that we can be doing that also through networks like the Global Covenant of Mayors and Mission Innovation. We're working with cities to try to, of course, also UNEP, etc., to work with actors at the country level and in the cities to build that knowledge hub. So hopefully that kind of international collaboration can help reinforce what you're talking about, of course, also through networks like the Global ABC, Alliance for Buildings and Construction. Cook, I'd like to turn to you because I'm sorry, there were some technical issues, and I know that it's late for you connecting from Vietnam, and you haven't had a chance to yet share the experience of how you're tackling extreme heat and urban cooling in Vietnam.
Can you hear me well now? Thank you for the support with the technical issue. I hope everyone can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lily. So for the case of Vietnam, we face quite significant challenge across the climate change impact, and among one of the 5 countries that are heavily affected by climate change, including cyclone, flooding, extreme heat. So we need to adapt to this, but this is a huge cost. And from the NDC that we just submitted recently, the public resources can only meet 30% of the adaptation need. And the fact that the country has got the temperature, the rise in temperature quite rapidly, both in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, our 2 biggest city in the country, that is causing a lot more people going to the hospitals, a lot of respiratory disease, and therefore we have been implementing the we have listed extreme heat as one of the public health risks that we need to undertake in our NDC implementation. There have been a number of different cross-cutting policies that have been developed. For example, the Urban Green Growth Development Plan, the Law on Natural Disaster Prevention and Control, the Energy Efficiency law, and most recently we have just been joining with the Cool Coalitions with support of UNEP and GGGI. We have intention to bring on board the Cool Coalitions and to tackle extreme heat cooling via policy actions, but also to rethink about the urban design, and at the same time piloting the model for attracting finances. So I'm really thinking that these approaches all together will help the country in terms of sorting out the issue, and to help control the excessive growth in cooling demand of the country, because there's a fear that the power system that cannot stand the increasingly need. In Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, the demand for buildings and air conditioning have accounted for 70% of the total electricity use, which is very, very huge and heavy on the system. And for this reason, we feel there's a lot of support which is needed for guidelines, for technical expertise, and for funding. for the cities and provinces to better control the urban planning and synergize the different solutions. Yeah, and I hope that with the approach that we're going to test under the Sustainable Urban Cooling Project funded by KSAP, we could somehow piloting, and later on we can replicate the model. And at the same time, we try to do some policy through improvement by making expanding the environmental fund, the protection fund, to be one of the mechanism, one of the workable mechanism that can spread out the cooling endeavor by people, and linking up with various policies and plans, and to support the cities with their cooling effort. So that's what I have for now. Thank you, Lily.
Thank you very much, Cook. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to note all the things that you're doing, quite a lot of action. So I don't think I know. I won't re-summarize all of that, but it was exciting to hear also that you're developing some kind of funding, financing mechanism, and integrating this cooling work into your environmental fund to support cities. So clearly, again, a very nice integrated model of support from national to local. So that was very interesting to hear from you, and so I thank you for that. I think maybe I can turn to you, Winston, and you can also tell us a little bit about the Cooling Singapore initiative. I know that this is a major effort to build a decision support system to help reduce the urban heat island effect, and be interesting to hear a bit more about this as we discuss solutions.
Definitely happy to talk about Cooling Singapore. It's currently in its third iteration, CS 2.0. There were two previous projects in the CS initiative, 1.0 and 1.5. The current initiative is to build upon the previous work that we've developed since 2017, which examines the different combinations of urban heat island adaptation and mitigation, and see which solutions work best in the Singapore context. Most of these solutions are extremely familiar to many. It's all the important stuff that Ian mentioned earlier, from green and blue infrastructure, smart urban design, and the Sudhir's flag waving of district cooling, which we tend to utilize a lot in Singapore. So all these approaches and practices are extremely well documented and summarized in the Cooling Handbook, which I think I invite everybody to read in there, and the examples from Cooling Singapore are included in that handbook. In the CS project, however, we also look beyond just reductions in temperature. We consider the impacts on outdoor thermal comfort in Singapore. So it's not just air temperatures we're interested in examining. We also examine how urban design and all these solutions affect radiant temperatures. For instance, how shading affects or makes things more comfortable for people at pedestrian level, but also the impacts on wind speed and humidity, and how that would affect citizens and residents and visitors to Singapore. The challenge is that measures that can work for the heat island might not be good solutions for outdoor thermal comfort. For instance, vegetation, the green infrastructure component, is extremely effective for heat island mitigation because of shading and because of the evapotranspirative aspect. But it is not that effective for thermal comfort, because in high humidity and low wind conditions, the extra humidity or evapotranspiration will definitely make things more uncomfortable for people. So urban design in this context really needs to consider how green infrastructure can be integrated with the existing low wind conditions and high humidity conditions in Singapore, so that pedestrians don't feel uncomfortable for the majority of the year. So in this current phase, yes, we are working in Cooling Singapore. We are working with governmental agencies, those ministries that have a direct stake in how to manage the increased urban warmth. to utilize this decision support system to examine how what-if scenarios of future development can result in different temperatures and different thermal comfort conditions. So this DSS helps to assess the net costs and benefits for both temperatures and for outdoor thermal comfort over different spatial scales in Singapore. We're looking at, for instance, what greenfield or brownfield sites for future developments can lead to the most ideal conditions for heat island mitigation or enhancement of outdoor thermal comfort for a particular precinct. At this point, Lily, if I could share this video that illustrates the prototype DSS that we have tried to implement in the Singapore context. So if you've been to Singapore, you know that this is the island. And what we do is that we examine different precincts, some a residential example in this case, where we can look at the current design for a particular time of the year, and we can then plot what the resulting thermal comfort conditions can be or temperature conditions are at pedestrian level. We can compare it with a what-if scenario. Let's say we change the urban design to include more platforms. We raise the platforms, we allow for unimpeded wind flow at pedestrian level, and we can compare and contrast which design plan can lead to a better outcome for heat island mitigation and thermal comfort for that particular precinct. So we've done this for 3 examples in the previous iteration for Cooling Singapore. You can see one example here for the current financial area in the south, in the Marina Bay district. And here is one example for a high density, high rise residential area in the south of Singapore. The plan, I'll stop sharing now. The plan is to expand this for the majority of the island, in Singapore, so that policymakers can then do a large scale for island-wide, but also a fine scale for individual precincts to see what options worked for heat island adaptation mitigation as well as for outdoor thermal comfort. And they can do this sort of analysis with confidence because we're using validated models of energy consumption, of vegetation models, of traffic, building, and climate models, so that policymakers who use the DSS can have confidence in making the right choice to mitigate additional urban warmth. Yep, back to you, Lily.
Yeah, very interesting, Winston. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. I think it reinforces the point that Yves Laurent made earlier about the importance of national institutions to build the tools and the resources to support action at the state level. And I think this is a perfect example of a tool that's been developed that will be able to actually facilitate local policymakers to tackle the urban heat island effect. So great example. Thank you for that. Maybe Graham, I can go to you quickly. We just heard from an example from Winston about really great local decision-making tools, like tools to support local decision-making. We heard from Cook also about really great efforts at the national level to support the action. And Yves Laurent started to hint at both national support and also the need to, share knowledge, perhaps also globally. Maybe I can turn to you and say, given your role at Mission Innovation, what do you think how do we need to work together to scale action on urban cooling, in your opinion?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks very much. I mean, I think the starting point is I think we've got to address the barriers, and I think the barriers are pretty common across the world, and there's a mix of sort of business policy and technology. And I think Laurent mentioned about technology. A lot of the technology innovations is about integration. Lots of solutions already exist, and it's how we go about applying this relatively conventional technology in a way that perhaps we're not familiar with. So I think we can learn from each other internationally. So hot countries, okay, that are used to the application of cooling, can perhaps help those countries that are on the journey to perhaps overheating in the first instance. I think it's really important that we recognise the points at which decisions are going to be made to be influential in cities. And I go back to the points that Ian made at the beginning, that actually the cities are really important, important and influential within the city itself. nationally they're really important, and internationally, and directly they control a limited amount of emissions themselves, but they have many other levers that they can influence. So planning, so place shaping and planning. I think showcasing is really important so that we can bring together sort of shared knowledge where we've demonstrated where something has been done in one particular city, and we can translate that to another city is really important. I think engaging with partnerships, making sure that we're working together, engaging with and communicating. And I think Winston also mentioned the word benefits. Okay, and I think it's critical that we highlight the benefits of cooling in cities. There are benefits, and we make sure we highlight these when we're trying to convince those that need to be convinced that we need to make some actions now. So I think working together internationally, I think will help this, and I think this is a really good start, and it will be great to continue this conversation, great to continue this work over the next couple of years, and if Mission Innovation can be part of that, we'd love to. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. We're very much looking forward to working with Mission Innovation on these issues. So I will now go to Cook, and then I'll quickly ask a question also to Steer, and then in about a few minutes, I'd like to open the floor in case there's questions from the audience. So audience members, please feel free to put your questions already in advance in the chat box, and I'll take them just in a few minutes. Cook, maybe if you could just tell us some of the, this is the Innovate4Cities conference, and I know that you mentioned so much activities that you're undertaking and enabling cities to take action. What are some of the innovative approaches and solutions that you see or you think you will see in these rapidly growing cities in Vietnam? Cook,
thank you for the questions, Lily. It is quite a complicated mix of issues that need to be addressed. So in the cities that we trying to work on, they often are fast growth cities, but also at the same time they poor urban design and sometimes insufficient green cover surfaces, and these all driving the urban heat island and in those particular areas. So so the question is what approach we have taken, right, toward these cities. Is that correct?
What are some of the innovative approaches that you're seeing cities take to tackle urban cooling?
Okay. So for these cities, we do have to take a lot of at the same time we have to consider what are the challenges that they are facing, and also there has been a lot of solution in order to we're trying to find a way that so that they can tackle at both the national and the province level. For example, I do mention about the environmental fund, which is the mechanism that can provide funding to the cities in order to help them replicating the work that they're doing. But at the same time, with more interventions at the city levels, we try to pilot the urban cooling action plans concept, which is something that we think it could work out best in the city, and for that reason, we do really need to have the shared guidelines and the technical expertise for those cities in order to build up. For the moment, we have started with the cities that have their extreme heat plan, and they are having issues that need to also adapt with their other adaptation issues, and we hope that by linking up these various policies at different levels, we can make sure that the supporting to the cities will be as much as possible and will meet their need.
Thank you so much for describing how you're tackling the the work with the cities in Vietnam. Sudhir, you've mentioned that Tabrid is working quite a bit on district cooling. Can you tell us more about enabling policies? Not so much about the technology, but the enabling policies that are letting cities actually take up these kinds of solutions, innovative solutions.
Yeah, sure, Lily. I think even before I answer that, just to put things in perspective, and again, with context to India, right? I mean, so July this year, India touched its all-time peak energy demand in India's history. So it was about 190 plus gigawatts. And there were some estimates that suggested that, 16% of that was essentially for air conditioning, right? So in itself, it doesn't seem too much. Now, the Ministry of Climate Change in the India Cooling Action Plan.
Sudhir, could you speak just a little bit louder? It's a little bit faint.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me just remove, yeah, so sorry.
In the meantime, audience, please ask questions in the chat box. This is your opportunity, and you can also ask questions to Jan, who's the author of the Urban Cooling Handbook. Sorry,
any better, Lily? No?
Yes, this is much better. Thank you.
Right. So, like I said, I'm just put things in perspective, right? I mean, this year, in this July, again, with context to India hit its all-time peak energy demand in July this year, in which there were some estimates that suggested about 16% of that was for air conditioning. Now, if you look at what the India Cooling Action Plan from the Ministry of Climate Change talks about, they say that, by 2030, about a fourth of India's peak energy demand will be for cooling, right? And again, and you look at the forecasts of IEA and so on and so forth, by 2050, 45 to 50% of India's peak energy demand is going to be for cooling, right? So it's no longer something that can be ignored in a way. Looking at it from a broader perspective, it is pretty much the single largest contributor to energy demand growth, as well as climate change and so on and so forth. I would say from India's standpoint. Now, like some of the panelists have already mentioned before this, it's not a question of technology availability. And in many parts, I don't think it's a problem of capital availability as well. It's primarily around execution, innovation around execution. And that's where I think the big gap is. It's how do we ensure that basis, not just examples that have worked elsewhere, but given the complex governance structure and the overall environment of a country like India, how do you ensure that the right models can be put in place to make sure there's more rapid adoption of things like district cooling? And there, I think beyond just going directly into PPP model and so on, I would just look at it as probably 2 or 3 very, very broad high-level areas. Really. One is basically the center, state, and the city integrate. And we've spoken about this already, right? The coordination between these 3 layers of government. How can that be integrated better? And along with that, we've also seen through the urban energy partnerships as well. You also have the electricity distribution companies that come totally outside of urban planning that need to also come in place together. So one, of course, is all of them coming together in a way to be able to really tangibly come out with execution models that can help this work. And if that magic formula exists, then I would think it's primarily at this cycle of development, I would think it's primarily around mandating and licensing. That's about it. I don't think you need any other extensive policy environment at this point of time, because conceptually, you don't need any viability gap funding. This is cost effective and sustainable as well, right? What is missing is basically some form of urban planning, mandating and licensing to ensure that there is much faster adoption. So yeah, it's integrated planning plus translating into slightly more forceful implementation through mandate is where I would see what needs to be done to make things work.
Great. So if I can now, thank you. So integrated planning and some licensing is and some good business models, but and I guess capacity building associated with that. So what I wanted to say now is it's time for questions from the audience, and I see one that has already come in. The question is from Miriam Vadino, I think from ICLEI, if I'm not mistaken. How can we massively renovate and connect existing buildings at the district level, considering the need for private citizens to engage directly? Who would like to take that? Either Yves Laurent, Ian, or anyone else, put your hand up. I see Yves Laurent's pen hand up, okay. And I don't know, Ian, was that also a hand or? I'm going to go to Yves Laurent first.
Yeah, thank you for the question. What our experience, France has 23 networks of district cooling. It's one of the most advanced country on district cooling, and we have so what we know is that it works, that it's mostly public driven. I'm gonna answer this question, and that we have a very developed industrial sector, for example, Dalkia Energy, Engie, Veolia, etc. And because there is a necessary partnership between private and public, because public has to drive the command in order, because the investing costs are very important and long-term visibility is necessary, but also continuity, guaranteeing continuity of service and access to best technology comes from the private sector. So what we know is that for these reasons, mostly it is public buildings, office, educational buildings, hospitals that are using district cooling. This is good and this is bad. Little housing. So how can we get to rich housing, or what solutions can we get, if possible, for the private houses that is a multi-property housing? It's not exactly the same everywhere. I think in Singapore, lots of buildings are owned by only one institution, or so it's easier. But we have several questions like that. So what we think is that first, and I'm happy to answer this question on behalf of Global ABC, because it was not included, but in my occupations here, I'm the co-chair of Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction that is mostly working with the Cool Coalition, these questions of buildings. And one part of our global status report this year is made by the Cooling Coalition at this regard. So, because the cheapest energy you use is the one you don't use, actually. So renovation is a real question. We are getting into a renovation wave at big scale in Europe. This is very complex, but it's taking now. I think everybody has this idea in mind. It will necessitate lots of money and lots of know-how also, because it's not only to take the decision of renovating in our countries. It's depending on the material you use, for example, it will be good or not good for summer comfort. We have a new regulation in France that is including summer comfort, but you can perfectly, in lots of places, use some materials for the envelope of the building. Some how do you say that? Insulation materials that will be not effective for the summer and for the heat. So you need to use the proper techniques. So you have to massify in some way both renovation and techniques. That's mostly what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Yves-Laurent. I wanted Jan to also come in, but I'm aware that we have 4 minutes left, and they will just switch to the next session after that. So we've had such an intense and rich discussion that we're running out of time now. So I'm going to actually hand over, if it's okay, to Andy Deacon, and encourage everybody in the audience to be in touch directly with Jan, who has a lot of information on this topic to further discuss. Andy, over to you. And one more thing, all panelists, thank you very much for joining us. And please feel free to put one word into the chat for Andy on what you think is the first action that cities can take on urban cooling. Andy, over to you.
Okay, then I'll pick those up from the chat in the moment. And thank you, Lily, and thank you, colleagues, for the fascinating session. Always good to hear about the very practical examples, and a really good example of the content that you can expect throughout the Innovate4Cities conference. This is the first session in an absolutely jam-packed week, and looking forward to interaction with our now more than 5,000 registered participants through the course of this week. So thank you again all so much for kicking that off very well. The Global Covenant is very pleased to have supported the production of the Urban Cooling Handbook, but really the production of the material is only the kind of start of the job in this area. And of course, the next step is to do all that we can to get as many cities as possible then using it. So we look forward to doing that. The work has very strong links to the Global Covenant's ongoing work on research and innovation, on data and on climate finance. And we've heard about all of those topics through the course of this session, each of those picked up through our 3 key initiatives. And you can find some more information on globalcovenantandmayors.org about all of that. We will be adding the handbook once it's released on November the 3rd, was that key date to remember for the formal release into our resource center. And we'll be integrating it into the GCOM Climate Action Journey. So all of our now more than 11,500 cities can then have access to the material and have an opportunity to use it. And we'll be contacting key regions, cities and nations about adopting the handbook and moving forward on sustainable cooling once it's out there and out and about. The work links very closely to some of the work that Lily, you mentioned, Graham has spoken about as well under Global Mission Innovation, and to the work that we've been supporting for both Race to Zero and Race to Resilience. And there will be a lot more coming on all of that at COP26. Importantly, all of the contributions to Innovate4Cities are then feeding into our ongoing development of the updated Global Research and Action Agenda on Cities and Climate Science, and a really important opportunity there to build on the legacy from Edmonton a few years ago and to continue to advance the work forward. So really that was just a shameless plug for linking this activity to lots of other ongoing initiatives, but really looking forward to building on the examples that we've heard today and others that Ian and colleagues are integrating into the handbook, and driving forward towards uptake and implementation on the basis of all of the good work that everybody's spoken about today. Thank you.
I guess that's a wrap. Thank you. There was lots of things in the chat, but it's been a great session. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a good night or day. Bye-bye.